Live any second. 3, 2, 1, and it looks like we're live. Hi, folks. I'm Bradley J. And this is the broadcast, if you will. We're with Anthony Sammarco on this tremendous occasion of the completion and the publishing of his latest book called The Other Red Line, and we'll get to that. But first, Anthony, are you enjoying this at least semi-post-pandemic summer?
I am. We're on Austerville on Cape Cod, and we basically have a lovely garden and a fruit orchard, and the animals seem to be very happy. But I think in a lot of ways it's kind of nice in semi-retirement to be enjoying the good weather and beach and taking day trips. So it's quite fun.
Yes, and everyone's, and not always having to wear a mask. That's a big thing.
I guess. I think in a lot of ways it's fortunate that we've all survived, though many of us have lost family and friends. But the whole concept is this is something that's been a very long 18 months. And I think if we still have precautions, we'll probably go on for another 18 months before we really semi-return to normality.
Right. So let's get to the book. It's called The Other Red Line. What does the title mean?
Well, the other red line was actually in regards to the Red Line, the MBTA Red Line that connected, of course, parts of Boston. But I called it the other red line because it connected Scully Square and the Combat Zone via Washington Street. So in this instance, it was a book that you and I had discussed close to 2 to 3 years ago on your wonderful program, Jay Talking on WBZ Radio 1030 iHeartRadio. And the idea was, in some ways, that we did various programs and talked about Lost Boston and the things that not only we, but your listeners remembered. So in this instance, I tried in some ways to not only chronicle the early history of the 19th century, but then to actually bring in the burlesque of Scully Square and the striptease of the Combat Zone.
So what was the Combat Zone?
Well, the Combat Zone is something that in popular memory, it hasn't existed now in almost 2 decades, was something that truly was a combat zone. It was called a combat zone simply for the fact that not only during the period of World War II, we would see not only soldiers and sailors going to the various bars, and there seemed to be a fight every single week, but it was also something in some ways that we saw the advent in the late 50s and 1960s of adult movies. And these were things that were actually filmed in some ways at places that had once been legitimate theaters. So during that period, the aspect of triple X-rated movies was something that attracted a whole new clientele. So with movies, peep shows, adult cinema, bars, and of course even dives, we began to realize that the Combat Zone, either we were attracted to it and participated, or we realized in some ways that it was something that we should stay away from. I actually thought it was probably one of the most colorful and vibrant areas of the city of Boston because it seemed in some ways a cross-section of American life. And it was something that was titillating on one hand and sordid on the other.
It was sexy and scary and dark and dangerous and something on the bucket list of every hormone-riddled young person. Correct?
It most certainly was. And I think in this book, what I've tried to do in a little bit of a more subdued aspect was to create something that people could not only identify with, but also begin to realize that it was something that truly had arisen as Scully Square waned in the 1940s and 50s, late 40s. We saw the Combat Zone arising. So in that period, I say in the book that the new name of the neighborhood was the Combat Zone, which was coined when in 1951, Judge George Roberts said of the area, quote, "It is really a combat zone," unquote. And it was also popularized through a series of expose articles on the area by Gene Cole, a writer for the Boston Daily Record in the 1960s. So by the 1970s, this was a major attraction, not just in Boston, but throughout New England. And it said that in the 1970s, there were over 36 sex-related businesses, including adult bookstores, peep shows, nude dancing venues, and they were all along Washington Street, the Red Line of Boston.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask next. Approximately where was the combat zone for folks who don't know?
Well, if one is in Boston, Washington Street is where we think of not only Filene's and Jordan's and formerly Gilchrist, these were large department stores, but as one came down Washington Street past Avery Street, which connects, of course, as a ladder street to Tremont Street, it's from Avery Street all the way to Neeland and Stewart Street. So it's really only 3 blocks. But in that 3 blocks, I think one could have actually had everything under the sun. It was something that was unique. It was salacious on one hand, it was titillating on the other, but it also was something that was a true composite of post-World War II Boston. And of course, Mayor White, Kevin White himself, wanted to designate the area as the adult entertainment district because it could be contained in a specific area. And rather than spread through the cities and, heaven forbid, the neighborhoods of the city, this could be an area that one would think could be something that would actually be in a 3 block period. But in that instance, it expanded tremendously, especially into Chinatown. And of course, with it went vice, prostitution, and many other sordid things.
Do you think it was a tax revenue generator?
Oh, definitely.
And that's why they didn't really want to get rid of it because folks came to Boston from around the country to visit the spot.
I don't think people paid tax per se on their coins to an adult video, but I think one of the things is these buildings paid an incredible tax. One of the biggest things was that this property was so valuable. I mean, it was in downtown Boston, but it was being used in some ways in a way that really didn't generate day traffic, so to speak. But it seemed like by noontime and early afternoon, many people, businessmen included, would actually frequent the combat zone. And by the period of the 1980s and early 1990s, we began to see the area changing. And of course, if I bought a condominium at the Ritz-Carlton condos on Avery Street, I wouldn't want to come out of the garage and, of course, entail the combat zone. So the aspect was the demographics would change subtly, and of course, it ended. And I think in some ways, though the vice and the danger, and there were many people that were murdered, including a man named Popolo, who was a football player who was stabbed in the combat zone, many people themselves looked at this as something that not only produced taxes, but it also provided income, because it was said that Tenny Vinos, who, according to Howie Carr, who is better known by the underworld moniker of Tenny Venus, was the dominant figure in the combat zone from the 1960s to the early 1980s. And he paid off mafia boss Gennaro Angiulo for protection and operated a string of clubs with his brothers, Louis and Larry Vinos. So it wasn't just taxable revenue for the city of Boston, it was also graft that was actually paid by people for protection, so to speak.
You can help me out with the actual physical locations of things. So Scully Square, William, as in William Scully, Square is associated with the combat zone, but I think of Scully Square kind of, and this may be where I'm wrong, near Government Center, but the combat zone was kind of down lower on Washington.
Correct.
They seem separate to me geographically, but they're thought of together in historically.
Well, they're connected by Washington Street, but they're connected more in the adult entertainment. Now, you had to realize Scully Square itself is between what is today City Hall Plaza and 1, 2, and 3 Center Plaza, the wonderful curvilinear building that's actually on Cambridge Street. But at that time, it was called Court Street. And Court Street, which still exists, would have actually curled to actually meet Cambridge Street. Scully Square was truly a square. It was an open area. And in the 19th century, it was a transportation center for the city. We saw in the very center a building where William Scully, as you just said, lived. But he was also the man who dispatched and greeted stagecoaches arriving and departing the city of Boston. And by the period of the 1860s, that area, which had once been a somewhat polite area, began to take on little bit of a shady overtone, because adjacent to it were not only places such as the Crawford House, but also the Old Howard, two buildings that would actually be on either side of the square itself, where we saw burlesque. Now, burlesque in the late 19th and early 20th century could be both risque photographs of women in tights showing their ankles, but it could also have been everything from entertainment by performing dogs, Siamese twins, the fat lady, and all sorts of different things that actually showed entertainment for the masses. But by the early 20th century, Scully Square had a number of legitimate movie houses. Granted, they were silent initially, then they became talkies, but they were major movie houses and they attracted many, many people. But by the 1920s and 1930s, the aspect of this burlesque was something that attracted the likes of Ann Corio, Sally Rand, Gypsy Rose Lee, and many other performers. And in that instance, we realized this was an area adjacent to Beacon Hill, adjacent to the West End, and of course, with Court Street to the financial and insurance section of Boston, State Street. So it was something in a lot of ways that really did change. But one of the things that I really love is a lot of the women who performed in these burlesque, and burlesque in this instance was such a tame aspect in the 21st century, if we compare them. But many of these women who were a panoply of strippers who would actually adopt Boston Brahmin surnames. So in the mid 20th century, there were strippers known as Honey Alden, Belle Air, Faith Bacon, Candy Cotton, Betty Howard, Jenny Lee, Cookie Shaw, Honey Standish, and even Barbara Curtis, who ironically billed herself as the proper Bostonian.
Like Kitty Waldo Emerson.
Exactly. And I think in a lot of ways it was a pun, but it was a well taken pun. And many Bostonians themselves realized in some ways it was far more tame than we can imagine. Our fathers and grandfathers must have been quite titillated by it, but in today's standards of the 21st century, it was more than polite.
When you start talking about the early history of William Scully Square, you go back to when there was actually an orchard that William Scully's office, I read, looked out at a charming orchard. Maybe it wasn't Scully's office. Maybe it was I think it was the daguerreotypist that lived there.
Well, Southwood Hawes.
Josiah Hawes, yeah.
Yes. Southwood and Hawes were a very well-known daguerreotypist partnership. And in their area, which was called Tremont Row, would actually be where 1, 2, and 3 Center Plaza is today. It was a wonderful connected amount of buildings. First floor would always be shops, and upper stories would be photography studios, artist studios, architects, various types of offices. But directly behind that was Pemberton Square. And Pemberton Square was an equal to Lewisburg Square on Beacon Hill. And when it was laid out between 1833 and 1834, it attracted China trade families, among the wealthiest families in Boston. So we saw Curtises, Forbeses, Lincolns, Cushings, many families actually having a row house. And of course, by the 1860s, early 1870s, because they were only a stone's throw from Scully Square, many of these families hightailed it to the Back Bay. And the area itself began to be developed as a commercial area. And eventually, the Suffolk County Courthouse. I mean, we saw at the very crest of Pemberton Square being built. And though some of the row houses, and I can remember them actually, survived, there was Barristers Hall, which was a attorney's building, offices for those that practiced at the courthouse. So the area did change, but remnants survived right through to the mid to late 1960s. And then, of course, everything was swept away in urban renewal of the West End, City Hall Plaza, and of course, city of the city itself.
Back to the combat zone, that survived There was still a significant combat zone through the mid 80s, correct?
Oh, very much so. When I was in college, I remember my professor, Roger Prouty, who took us on an architectural tour of Boston, would tell us as we arrived on a bus to the combat zone that we were only to look above the ground floor. We couldn't look at these other buildings. And of course, everyone looked. It was something that was a great attraction. And I think on weekend nights, it wasn't just adults, but it was young adults, both male and female, as well as even teenagers that would ride around the area of the combat zone, honking horns. People, there was street life. People were standing outside. They were coming out of bars. They were smoking. They were looking at this as something that it was truly a red light district, but there was energy, frenetic energy. And I think sometimes people related to it.
Kids would come from the suburbs to raise Cain, as it were.
And Abel as well.
Folks, we're here with Anthony Sammarco, and we are here on the occasion of the release of his book, The Other Red Line, which is basically the history of Boston's infamous combat zone. There it is. It's kind of interesting as a before and after. You see the before from what year, and then you see the combat zone. Well, what do you see now? You see,
well, at the very
describe
top
it for me.
Yeah, with the very top, one sees Scully Square in 1942.
Okay.
And on the left-hand side, you can see Tremont Row. And on the right-hand side, you can see the area of what is today Boston City Hall Plaza. So this is Court Street and Scully Square.
Okay.
And then below, you actually see what is the State Cinema. And I love it. It's actually a movie by the name of Spiked Heels and Black Tights and The Depraved.
The Depraved.
And this was a photograph from about 1969. And we began to realize that these were really big attractions. I guess adult-rated movies were things that truly were something prior to, I hate to say this, videos and then DVDs. But of course, we now have streaming directly on the television with such things as YouTube. That was something that drew people into downtown Boston. And it wasn't just evenings, and it was weekends. And sometimes they were open as early as 11 o'clock on a business day morning. Mm-hmm. So I think the whole aspect of this book, which is very different from the books that I've written, which are very polite. They're about the neighborhoods of the city of Boston. They chronicle the history and development. But this was something that you and I had discussed as something that it's not just the fact that it was interesting, it no longer exists, but it was something that was an important part of the evolution of Boston. And I think sometimes, though it's actually been somewhat lost, we can only remember it through photographs.
So later on, why don't we have you tell us where you might be speaking to maybe get a signed copy of the book, and also tell me now where you can get the book. Amazon and
you can
bookshops everywhere?
You can get it in any major bookstore, Barnes & Nobles, but you can order it on Amazon. And if you order 2 copies, you'll probably get free shipping. I have not booked yet. It just has arrived. One of the things, my mantra is I never book a lecture until I actually have the book in hand.
Yeah.
I've done that prior, and it's been very embarrassing. But this is a book in some ways. I also want to tell people that when I wrote it, I dedicated it to Bradley Jay. And it says that this book is dedicated to Bradley Jay, the popular host of Jay Talking on WZZ Radio 1030 iHeartRadio, who suggested the topic of this book, and also to his wonderful listening family. I think in a lot of ways, I enjoyed the midnight to 2 a.m. shifts that you used to give me once a month. They were a lot of fun, though I went to my office the next morning at 8 o'clock, usually with one eye on a cheek. But I think in some ways, it was something that made people really begin to realize what talk radio is all about. It's something that involves us.
You stayed for 2 hours each time as well, which is a significant chunk of time to do any topic. Let's get into the thing that makes this book different, really, the personalities involved. the people that both the supply and demand side of the people involved. There are the people that are entertaining, the entertainers, and then the entertainees sometimes who shouldn't have been there doing stuff they shouldn't have been doing. Politicians, etc., who are some of the luminaries on either side of the supply and demand fence.
Well, I think in a lot of ways, when you think about the demand, it was everyone in Boston. I mean, people that went to the old Howard, which was, if one can imagine, formerly a place of worship, had become a temple of worship. But in that instance, there were people of all walks of life that included both men and women, as well as college students, who realized in some ways that this was something that was really an attraction. I always think some way that it's something that truly was a cross section. It didn't matter who you were, what your background. And it was something that I think in a lot of ways, I use a quote that's in the book, and I say that burlesque was king. And the anointed queens of burlesque danced at both the Crawford House and the Old Howard in the Scully Square area. And not just in Boston, but they were known incredibly around the world and had well-known performers who were beloved by their audience. It was not just adult men who typically patronized the burlesque theaters, but as Allison Arnold of the Boston Globe said so sardonically, quote, many a Harvard freshman sneaked into the Old Howard and glanced furtively around to see if there was anyone who recognized him and tell his old man that he'd been there. As he was going out, one young man was chagrined to meet his father going in. In many instances, it went generationally, as well as that cross-section of Bostonians, from Brahmins to the rest of us. And I think the whole concept is that it truly was something that not only we enjoyed, but during World War II, Scully Square had become a vortex that seemed to draw people of all walks of life to the unabated excitement of the nightly entertainment, and left no one the same as when they departed. So it was something that really did change people.
And well, I was fortunate enough to get to know on a personal level Princess Cheyenne. Talk about Princess Cheyenne, because she became a DJ at a local radio station, WBCN,
yes,
where I also worked. So we were colleagues, and I used to became social pals with her.
Well, I told people when I was writing this book, I said, little did one know that royalty actually was in the combat zone.
Right.
So during that period of the 60s and 70s, people like Tempest Storm, Amber Mist, Satan's Angel, as well as even people such as, of course, Princess Cheyenne, all danced in the combat zone. But Princess Cheyenne was someone who was a very different cut of fish. This was somebody, she would dress in an Indian headdress with blue feathers and a beaded costume, and she became a headliner at the Naked Eye Cabaret on Washington Street in the combat zone. But the whole concept was that Harvard Lampoon, the president at that time, must have invited her to a banquet in 1982. And he referred to as a, quote, nice and educated girl when he introduced her. Well, she danced for those of the membership of the Harvard Lampoon. But few of them realized that she had attended Emma Willard, one of the foremost young ladies' preparatory schools in the United States. And she was obviously condoned the Striptease Act as being polite and acceptable to the Harvard Lampoon. Few people realized that this woman was somebody who could belt out a beautiful dance to Betty Davis's eyes. And also, some ways, many people began to realize that she was not just a striptease artist, but she created the dancing and choreography and the costume as something that made her into an icon of the combat zone. And I think in a lot of ways, she was somebody, too, that not only was well educated, in a polite sense, but she actually went on to become a psychoanalyst. And
sometimes dancing is the only way a person could earn enough money to continue their education, which may have maybe what she did. I have a friend that was the case.
Well, don't forget the Combat Zone would also have the all college girl review. So I assume many of these young ladies were actually strip teasing between classes.
Yeah. Who else had really interesting name and a interesting persona that was involved?
Well, one of them was Fanny Fox. Now, the name might be familiar, but she was called, of course, the Argentine Firecracker. Her real name was Annabelle Battista, and she herself was somebody who would dance at the Pilgrim Theater. Now, she was beautiful, she had a wonderful body, and impressive costumes. She herself, however, would actually meet Wilbur Mills, who was a congressman in the United States Congress from Arkansas. And though he was a well respected man and been a Democratic nominee for the 1972 presidency, he somewhat would actually become sordid. And he associated himself with Fanny Fox, not only having an affair, because she and her husband lived in the same apartment complex as Wilbur Mills and his wife in Washington, D.C., but he would follow her from striptease to striptease act. Well, the whole idea was that Wilbur Mills himself was driving one night in a car in Washington, and when it was pulled over by the police, having run erratically, Fanny Fox attempted to flee the scene by jumping into the tidal basin, after which she began to refer to herself as the tidal basin bombshell. And in that instance, Wilbur Mills, disgraced, would actually resign as chairmanship of the House Ways and Means Committee, but he was reelected to Congress in 1974, but not seek a further election in 1976. So this is a man in the book that I not only show his official portrait in the United States Congress, but I show him hooting at Fanny Fox as she dances with feathers, not only in her hair, but all over her body, to create in some ways a salacious scene.
So the good news is that when you write each of your books, you find and obtain many excellent photos in each topic, and this book is no exception. You have many photos of really wild looking women from a long time ago. And it's a book that'll appeal to the academic historian type of folks and the person who would buy Playboy magazine.
Well, don't forget, I mean,
the gamut.
They're the pinup of the 1940s in Scully Square. And I mean, you had to realize that many of these women were the pinup girls of World War II. These were women who, in some ways, didn't just have a great body, but their act would make them, in some ways, extremely well known. One of them was Sally Rand, and she was a well known performer who began her career as an aerobic dancer in the carnivals in the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. But she would dance in a peekaboo outfit, which was simply a nude colored body stocking, using 2 6-foot-long fans. And she would dance back and forth, and it was all done to the tune of Claude Debussy's Au clair de lune. Other women that actually would dance were people that included such people as Sherry Britton and Corio, not only Sally Rand, Sally Keith, Gypsy Rose Lee, Joan Shawley, and Rosita Royce, who I love Rosita Royce, because she danced as a woman in her dance act of the Doves of Peace dance. And when she entered her stage, she would enter fully clothed, wearing long velvet gloves. And within minutes, her father would release 7 doves who landed on her gloved arms, shoulders, and head. Each bird weighed 14 pounds, which was nearly 3 times the size of ordinary pigeons. Wow. And as the music played, Miss Royce called each bird by their name, though it's not recorded what their names were, who then carefully and adroitly removed a piece of her costume. So I think in some ways, she and Zorita, the snake dancer, as well as even a woman named Yvonne DiCarlo, someone we knew from the Munsters as Lily Munster, all danced with things that they created, whether it was, of course, the doves or the snakes, or as Yvonne DiCarlo did with a huge King Kong gorilla. I think in a lot of ways, these were acts that people loved. And whether it was in Boston or in Cincinnati, they were the toast of the town. And these women, in some ways, had a following nationwide.
You know, if I had, I don't know, maybe 100 chances to go back in time for one moment, I would burn one of them and go back and see Lily Munster dancing. Something that'd be a good way to use up one of those trips back in time.
Well,
I don't know if I only had one, I might go back to ancient Greece, but if I had two, maybe one of them would be back in the heyday of the combat zone.
well,
So this book is a really quite different from Anthony's usual popular book. I expect it to be even more popular because I think it'll appeal to more people. I hope so. It's available as we speak, and you can get it on Amazon as well as the bookstores already. That's pretty impressive.
yes.
And all the very best of luck on this book and past books and future books. I think I texted you one time. I was in a, and this must be fun for you. One time I was in a pharmacy waiting in line, and I saw on the book rack, I think an entire rack dedicated to your books on different neighborhoods in town. By the way, if this is your first go round with Anthony, Anthony has books on most Boston neighborhoods, maybe all Boston neighborhoods, dedicated books that you can find. So search Anthony Sammarco. What should they search to find all your books?
Well, if you go on Amazon and you just type in my name, Anthony Sammarco, they'll pop up. But the whole concept is I'm up to 85 books. And right now I'm working on not only Halloween traditions in Boston, but I also started a book called Inferno. It's on the Great Boston Fire of 1872.
Good. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're busy,
Thank you.
but this has been very entertaining. And again, congratulations. And folks, get right on out there and get that book as soon as you can. Anthony,
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bradley.